Welcome to Rights in Russia's monthly English interview, February 27th, 2025. I'm Mary Page in Chicago, and today's guest is Richard Wright, speaking to us from London. Richard Wright has worked as a senior official in various roles in the EU and the UN for nearly 40 years, mainly in the areas of foreign and security policy and humanitarian affairs. As a postgraduate student in the USSR in 1975 and 6, he studied Soviet agriculture, then worked as a senior EU official from 1978 to 2011, returning to Russia as ambassador and head of the European Commission's delegation to Russia in Moscow in 2000 to 2004. He was director of UNRWA in New York from 2012 to 17. A graduate of Cambridge and Glasgow Universities, he was also a visiting fellow at the Weatherhead Centre for International Affairs, Harvard University. Since returning to the UK in 2017, Richard has been engaged in a number of activities, including participation in election observation missions, most notably in Ukraine in 2019. He has written the novel A Moscow Awakening and is currently working on a second book, The Triangle of Death, set in Palestine, that will be published in July. Welcome to Rights in Russia, Richard.
Thank you very much, Mary, and also to your co-host Simon, with whom I worked with in Moscow in 2000 to 2003. He was a great colleague and a real expert on human rights in Russia.
Absolutely. He was a colleague of mine too, and I absolutely agree. Your connection with Russia goes back to the 1970s when you were a postgraduate student in Moscow. Could you tell us something about that experience and what was the Soviet Union like in those days? And actually, what led you to study agriculture there?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mary. Yeah, so I mean, for me, it goes back to actually when I was at Cambridge and I did a course on actually Russian economic history, from the emancipation of the serfs in 1861 up until when I was at university in the 70s. And it was just the course was so well taught. It was almost like a classic case of a student or a child, being very influenced by a teacher. And in this case, a lecturer, Dr. Feinstein. It was just remarkable. And that really sparked my interest. So I decided, that I would do masters in Soviet studies. So I sort of pride myself on the fact that I've got a degree in a subject which doesn't exist anymore. Can't be many of those from Glasgow. But then as part of that, I did a British Council studentship in Moscow from autumn 75 through to summer 76, which was quite a daunting thing. And I decided that I didn't really want to go into most people actually went to places like Moscow University or equivalent in other towns. But I went to a smaller college called Timorazev Academy, which was a specialist college dealing with agriculture. So I was always interested in Soviet agriculture and the problems and the issues of it. So I studied there, and I was the only Westerner in the place, which is quite challenging. I was on my own, literally, so I had to stand on my own feet and grow up, and I think that's where I did grow up. And I traveled a lot. Actually, I went to Siberia, I went to Crimea and Kiev and other places. And I had a very interesting time and certainly sparked my interest in Russia. I learned to speak Russian reasonably well. I've forgotten a lot of it since, but that was really the starting point. And what was it like to live there? I actually had pretty good accommodation in a sort of what they called an общежитие, a sort of a place for visiting, heads of state farms and collective farms. So I met a lot of people there, and the day-to-day life was okay, I would say. But the first few months it was good because there was a surfeit of good quality products, meat, for example. But then it suddenly dried up in the early 1976, and the reason was the harvest had failed, and there had to be distress slaughtering of animals, and therefore there was a lot of meat available. But then it stopped. So from then onwards, from sort of January, February onwards, there were much less good quality meat on the market, for example, and they had introduced fish days, and that was. I think 2 days a week were nominated as fish days, and I remember going to a restaurant once and asking for a knife so I could eat my fish, and the lady saying you can't have a knife because you don't need a knife for fish, you just use a fork. So that was something that always stuck in my mind. But it was a fascinating time. I mean, it was a Brezhnev, Suslov, Kosygin period, the sort of triumvirate that ran Russia, with Brezhnev being the sort of primus inter pares. Lots of propaganda around, but people were perfectly friendly. I never felt I was tailed or harassed or anything like that. It was a very good experience.
Mhm. In 2000 to 2004, when you were ambassador and head of the EU delegation in Moscow, Putin had just come to power
Yeah,
after the
yeah.
huge changes that Russia saw in the
Mm,
1990s,
mm,
including becoming a member of the Council of Europe and putting it under the jurisdiction of the
mm,
European Court of Human Rights.
mm.
At that time, did you feel that democracy and human rights were becoming embedded in both Russian society and
Yeah,
government?
that's a very good question, and I think I wouldn't put it as strongly as that. I think that there was a growing awareness. I think what there was certainly, and Simon Cosgrove was involved with this, was a proliferation of non-governmental organisations who were trying to sort of inculcate or human rights in society, doing projects we were funding, and Simon was managing the funding of a lot of these projects. But we were certainly trying with other countries. The United States, we had a large technical assistance budget, and part of it was granted in that area too. But at the same time, one has to remember that there was, for example, a Chechnya war going on, which had been restarted in the late 90s after a very this blowing up of some blocks of flats in Moscow, very controversial about who was responsible for it. But I mean, the fact was that it was a Chechnya war. It was violent, nasty, vicious. In fact, a lot of the same things that we see today going on in Ukraine were going on in Ukraine. Were going on in Chechnya. I think Simon also went. I was talking to him the other day, but I went there twice, and it was just a very heavy sense of brutal oppression of people. It's the first time I saw refugees who'd been, just displaced people living in terrible conditions. The army was looting the money that was granted to people for their basic needs. They're getting 300 rubles, about $10 a month at the time, and 2/3 of that was going into the pocket of the army. There were disappearances. It's very reminiscent of, frankly, what's going on now, as I mentioned. So there was that, and there was also this sort of Putin did not tolerate dissent, and he went after the independent or relatively independent press, or Media Most, NTV. These were all sort of parallel signs. So on the one hand, while I think there were people who are genuinely interested in trying to push forward this agenda of human rights, rule of law, etc., it was also being pushed back on the other side. So it was a mixed. It was a mixed picture, and I think as time went on, towards the end of my stay there in 2004, I think the latter began to prevail, and we saw the arrest of Khodorkovsky. But all this was interspersed with sort of other events that made you a little bit more optimistic. For example, there was a huge gathering of world leaders in St. Petersburg in 2003 in May, which was to celebrate the 300th anniversary. This was convened by Putin. Everybody was there, the US president, all European leaders. And it was rather a joyous occasion. And we just went for a 3-day sort of boondoggle, right from one palace to another. It was great. And that, Putin, I always come back to this because he made a speech at some point saying that, St. Petersburg was built with the expertise of Europe and European craftsmen and scientists and architects, etc., which is perfectly true. And, St. Petersburg is a window of Russia to Europe. I mean, when one thinks where we are now, it's very different from what's going on today. And another event that sticks out of my mind completely different was in 2003, one of the Beatles, Paul McCartney, came to play a concert in Red Square in May. It was absolutely fantastic thing. You can see it on YouTube, actually. But it was a sort of symbol of, the more open Russia. It was a joyous occasion. But then, it didn't prevail. It didn't last. And we are where we are today.
And was there any way you could have foreseen the course of developments at that time? Did you have any inkling
No, not really. I honestly, no. I mean, I think, as I say, there were positive signs and there were less positive signs. I think it began to trend towards the less positive towards the end of my stay, and it certainly continued thereafter. So it was a sort of mixed picture. I think at the same time, we were grappling with, how to sort of build ties with Russia, and there were efforts to build so-called spaces of, economy, energy, things like this. Do I think that we absolutely did everything we could to try and establish a better and stronger partnership with Russia? No, I don't, and I'm actually not. Many people don't agree with me, but I don't. Would it have succeeded? Probably not. But I think we could have made more effort. There was, I don't say a lack of interest. There was interest amongst certain people in the EU, but some were less so. But Russia was pursuing its course, and Putin, he was gradually taking control of all the key levers of state, but also, business and institutions, NGOs. It was the beginning of sort of trying to corral the NGOs and this passing of this famous foreign agents law, which has been replicated in some other countries, in Georgia, actually, where I was recently. So it was all trending, but I think that, the main drift away from, Western standards, if I can put it like that, took place after I'd left. But it was rather balanced, I would say, but trending in a direction which was less favorable.
Mm-hmm. So now with Donald Trump as president in the U.S., talks have been taking place between the U.S. and Russia that have excluded Europe as well as Ukraine about the Ukraine war. So from a European and an EU perspective, how do you see these developments, and how should Europe and the EU in particular react? And I wondered if you could speak to how easy is it for the EU to speak with one voice? And if not easy, whose voices are the most important?
Yeah, look, those are a whole series of very, very important questions. I think the first thing to say is that I'm pretty horrified by the way the Americans are going about how to try and terminate this war. The way I was brought up, you don't concede all the things that the one party wants before you even sit down and have an agenda. I just made a list of them. So just talking directly to Russia over the heads of Ukraine and Europe was one. Announcing that Ukraine wasn't going to get its territory back, that there would be no NATO membership for Ukraine, even though it had been basically promised it back in 2008. No, certainly implying there'd be no US engagement in terms of providing a security a backstop for Ukraine. I mean, I think that's still in question, but nonetheless, the hint was provided. And frankly, ridiculous statements about Ukraine starting the war and the rest of it. I mean, so I think it's very unnerving, and I think we are at a very critical moment now, because if The EU obviously has to react. The likelihood is if there is to be some form of European force to, you know, provide some sort of backstop to any truce or that might be agreed, it's got to be European. I mean, the Americans are not put boots on the ground. Would they provide logistic support, intelligence, etc.? Still unknown. So I think this has actually thrown Europe into a bit of turmoil, to be perfectly honest. I mean, Europe's been dependent on the US security umbrella for the last 80 years, and it's coming to an end. And it looks as if it's coming to an end pretty brutally, with Ukraine being the vehicle under which this will happen. And I think, you know, Europe doesn't have the defense capabilities required to defend Europe. I mean, that's the reality. And because it's been too easy. Now, I mean, I mean, the French, to be fair to them, have been raising this for a long, long time about the need to be more autonomous and have an independent European pole of defence. But now, it's, you know, the chickens have come home to roost. And frankly, I think there's a bit of panic in Europe right now about what to do. And, you know, we get, I mean, certain capabilities like air defence and, you know, HIMARS, this type of thing, intelligence gathering, logistics support, heavy lift. These are things that Europe just doesn't have, the capabilities. And I was just listening to something a few minutes ago in the Financial Times where one of the correspondents said, you know, it's assumed that they would need 300,000. There are 300,000 American troops providing de facto security in Europe, 80,000 on the ground, 220,000 who could be mobilized. Well, if you lose all those, you know, that's a quarter of the total European, you know, military capability. So that has to be found some way. So there's a massive series of challenges out there. Is the Europe unified? I think the answer is no, because you have some recalcitrant countries, notably Hungary, Slovakia, who take a far more pro-Russian line. So if there is to be some form of European sort of backup force, it's probably going to be, you know, a type of coalition of the willing, which would include Britain, not an EU member right now, and Norway as well, plus, you know, Baltic countries and others who are in favourable France and Germany. A big question now for Germany, which is in the process of, you know, forming a government after the elections last Sunday, is, you know, to what extent they will rearm and help provide, you know, security forces for such a force. But I mean, I think this is a really big moment now. In Jean Monnet, one of the founders of the European Union, always said, you know, Europe will be created and forged through crisis. And I think I think most people would agree that we're at one of those moments. You know, we're staring it right in the face that Europe has got to step up now, because this sort of transactional approach that the current US government and Trump himself is taking is just forcing us into quite a dramatic change. I mean, he does say some things that are really just off the wall, like, you know, I think one yesterday about Europe has done a good job in ripping off the United States. I mean, you know, the United States was very much front and parcel of wanting the EU to develop as a bulwark against communism in the 1950s, and supported, you know, the creation of freedom, democracy, rule of law, etc. So, I mean, some of these sort of wilder statements, I guess one should just set to one side. But the reality is that, you know, there's big change coming. And I mean, American attitudes towards Ukraine have changed completely with the current administration. And you know, Zelensky is under huge pressure now. And, you know, frankly, I find it astonishing that, you know, the US seems to be spending more time on negotiating some form of access to Ukrainian minerals, when one would have thought the more important priority is actually stop the shooting and put this to one side. This is for the post-war situation. But anyway, far from me to understand exactly. But one way or another, I think, you know, we're in a very different world now, and I think Europe is gradually coming to recognise this. And this is this is, I'm just looking for something I made a note of here. An article in the Financial Times yesterday by Martin Wolf, very well-known correspondent. His headline of the article was, "US is now the enemy of the West." I mean, is it really, can it really be that? I mean, the world has changed, isn't it?
For sure, for sure. And with Trump, it's hard to know because he'll say anything. But
Yeah.
then he's actually doing almost anything too. So I think that that's been one of the surprising pieces of
But
that.
he needs to, he needs to think very carefully about his people around him, about the long-term implications of what he's doing, for the strength and unity of the Western world, maintain the peace for all this time. I mean, Europe is not America's enemy, far from it. We're all Atlanticists, pretty much. And if this gets broken or fractured, what will be the implication for Europe's relation, for example, with China? I think some question you maybe come on later. I mean, it'll force people to start, reevaluating existing situations and relationships. But my sense, though, a little bit is, this is. I think well-known British Lord Darragh, who was British ambassador in Washington, he says you have to look more at what President Trump and his people actually do rather than what they say. I think we're saying the same thing, and try and have to manage that. But I think as every day goes by, it's clear that there's going to be an upheaval in existing transatlantic relations, and we're going to have to adjust to it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that it's such a dynamic situation, it's difficult to predict anything right now, but do you think there's any way that Ukraine can continue to resist Russia without the support of the US? I mean, are there arrangements? I mean, I've read about there's a kind of a tripwire arrangement with European
Yeah.
soldiers, small number along the border that would initiate sort of a larger reaction. I mean, are there arrangements like that are under consideration, or do you think are possible?
Yeah, I think they're under consideration, absolutely. But the thing is, though, Mary, I mean, what is the rules of engagement of such a force? Is it to defend Ukraine, or is it just to monitor? I mean, the Russians have said they don't want any. They certainly don't want NATO troops, but I mean, they've also, I think, earlier said, or Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, said he didn't want any force there at all. But then, from the Ukraine perspective, they want security guarantees. What is if they don't have them, then they're at risk for further incursions at some point in the future. And let's remember the initial Russian goal was to decapitate the Ukrainian government. They thought they would just walk in and take Kiev, and the whole place would just be under their control very quickly, and it didn't happen because of the bravery and resistance of the Ukrainian forces. So no, I mean American equipment, because they provide certain things which no other country can provide, is very important. And if it's just stopped brutally, then it would have a massive impact. There's no doubt about that. And it's the United States that sort of organizes the filtering, or they bring people together at the American base in Wiesbaden. I mean, that's the area where the military coordination takes place. So, I mean, if that suddenly was to go, I don't think there's any sign of that yet. But I mean, that'll have a big impact. And the question then will be, would the resources that military and otherwise that Europe provides be enough? Now, Trump has sort of been waving around figures about 350 billion US support, which are not accurate at all. I mean, Europe has given more, but the US military support is very, very important. I think it's 60, 70 billion. I can't quite remember the exact figure, but an overall about 110, with Europe's about 150, 160. But no, I mean, it'll be a huge miss. So the big issue here is security guarantees. Now, back in the days in 1994, there was a memorandum, I think it was Budapest, a memorandum between Russia, Britain, US, and Ukraine, guaranteeing Ukrainian security when the nuclear missiles were removed from Ukraine. And there were a lot of them, I think around 1,000 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But that proved to be absolutely useless. I mean, it just failed. So the Ukrainians are not going to rely on something like that. They want hard-nosed guarantees that, you know, if their country is attacked again, that there is some form of defense for it, and it's backed up internationally. And that's the big issue, isn't it? That has to be solved. And whether it's, you know, what are the rules if there were to be a war? What are the rules of engagement? What happens if there wasn't? Are they going to defend Ukraine? Or are they just you know, peacekeepers who withdraw? I mean, all these things. I mean. And I mean, Zelensky has been demanding some sort of security guarantees in the process of the negotiations on this minerals fund, but he hasn't obtained them so far. So I guess that is the big question. What sort of force and who would man it? It won't be NATO. It's clear because the US doesn't want that. So if there is to be one, it's going to have to be some form of European coalition of the willing, because the EU won't be able to do it on its own, and probably wouldn't be able to get it agreed within the EU. I mean, it's a big issue, you know, because Ukraine's on the front line. Right. I mean, looking longer term, it's always been my view, and that a part of the solution to this is for Ukraine to join the European Union, because, first of all, if they were to do that, I think it's highly improbable that Russia would envisage going after or attacking a European Union member state. Now, it's not a military alliance in the same sense that NATO, but I still think it's just highly improbable. Of course, there are many issues related to this. There's a whole procedures. You have a long-winded procedure you have to go through, and negotiations to make sure that Ukraine that their government and their institutions, administration, etc., would be compatible with EU standards. And I don't want to minimize that, but you know, people should ask themselves, and what is the opportunity cost of not doing it? If we don't do that, you know, if we have to continue providing, you know, billions and billions of dollars or euros of economic and military aid, at some point, this is going to surpass, you know, what it might cost to, you know, absorb Ukraine into the EU. And I mean, I was there you know, for the Zelensky elections. I was one of the monitors, and you know, he won the election fair and square, without any doubt. There are imperfections for sure, but he won the election. He's democratically elected, and I was very impressed actually with the extent to which, you know, there's a civil engagement in civil society and a desire to do the right thing in terms of, you know, elections, and it's an important part of democracy. They've got a huge amount to do. There's corruption, you know, judges, rule of law, institutions, all this sort of stuff, but it can be done, and I think they would do it. And Russia itself has actually not even suggested the other day in something I read that they would not object to Ukraine being a member of the EU. So I think this is a part of it. It's not all of it, but it's a part of it. And of course, then you can just say, well, what Ukraine? Is it Ukraine? Is it current borders, or current, you know, 80% of the original, or the whole country? I mean, all that is another set of issues. But I still think, I mean, the big problem is how you absorb agriculture, which is just massive, you know, and with swamp.
But what do you mean how you absorb agriculture?
Well, I mean, you know, they would be part of European arrangements on agriculture, which is a very sensitive issue for all countries.
Yeah.
And you know, they have I think you know, Ukraine's exports are, I think, 10% of world agricultural output comes from Ukraine. It's like a breadbasket of Europe and beyond, you know, in Africa. And so when it was disrupted in the war, it was a very serious impact on the grain market. So, you know, there's a big issue how you would provide for the integration of Ukrainian agriculture into the EU. But you know, there's no doubt there's huge support for it in Ukraine. And I think one thing I learned from monitoring the election with Zelensky was that Ukraine, they had no idea who they were voting for, to be honest. I mean, they knew who the guy was, but they didn't know what he stood for or anything else. But the one thing they did know is they did not want a continuation of this sort of past, corrupt, you know, oligarch-controlled government. They threw them out, and they knew what they were doing for that on that side of it. You know, I must say I find it rather admirable actually what they did, and I'm very convinced that this is a part of the solution, but it'll take a long time. Now, if you get, you know, if there was sufficient political will, in my view, it could be done fairly quickly.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
and you know, the trick is, and this was the case for all the enlargements in Baltic states, Hungary, Czech Republic, etc. You just have to confront, you know, the local interests that are trying to block it, and say, okay, fine, this is what you've got to do to come into the European Union. You either do it or you don't come in, and then it gets done. And that's exactly the way how it's always worked. You know, you you rebut arguments blocking behavior by people who are trying to oppose it by saying that. And it's a very it's a magnet, which in this case I think would be very important. And it doesn't appear that the Russians would object to it. I don't think they should have a veto or anything like that. But so I think that's part of it. And there is a clause actually in the EU treaty, a sort of solidarity clause, which, you know, arguably could be employed were Ukraine to be set upon in the future. I don't think it would happen. So anyway, that's my take on it. Many people don't agree, but that's what we're all here for, right?
Yes, exactly. Right. Well, this is totally fascinating. We're kind of running out of time. For my last question, I'd like to turn to your books.
Ah,
And just I was interested the extent to which your novels, both A Moscow Awakening and The Triangle of Death, are based on your experiences in Moscow and with UNRWA. And why did you turn to fiction as a genre? Like,
yeah. Well, I thought about, you know, I had a lot of interesting experiences both in Russia and my time in the EU, and you know, I could have written them all up. I mean, I went to, for example, I must have been to about 10, 12 meetings with President Putin. Every 6 months there was a summit. And, you know, the famous figures involved, you know, from Chirac from France, Berlusconi, one of the infamous summit we had with Russia in 2003. And you know, these were interesting meetings, you know, because you're sitting there and you're eyeball to eyeball with very important people. But you know, there's a lot of very good memoirs of diplomats everywhere. So I just thought I'd try something different. I tend to try to branch out and do sort of strange things from time to time. So um, I thought I'd give it a go. So I tried to draw, for the first one, my Moscow Awakening, I drew on my experiences of as a student, but also my time as ambassador, and just tried to pull out some bits and pieces from it and turn it into a novel. And I realized after a short time that there was a difference between a novel writing, or trying to write a novel, I should say, and writing a sort of, you know, a memorandum to somebody in your hierarchy. You know, it's almost an inversion of that because you have to in a novel you have to sort of as somebody told me, you know, show but don't tell, you know, and it's exactly the opposite of what you do when you're writing a memorandum to a colleague. You know, you actually tell and then show,
mhm.
you know. So that, I mean, it took a bit of learning, and I had to jettison some passages. I spent a long time creating a beautiful menu in Zurich that had to go. Because in the end, I sought the advice of an editor who was marvelous. Actually, she really helped me a lot. So anyway, what came out, what came out. But I so the first part of it is very much drawn on my personal experiences. Then I sort of try to develop a plot, um, and I think I think what I've got to learn a lot more about is sort of characterization. I think a lot of people who've read it said, you know, it does resonate about what the atmosphere was like in Moscow at the time, which was in the 70s. That was roughly the period I was there. I just moved it forward 1 year. Um, but I did a lot of research, you know, and one of the wonderful things here in London, well, in Britain is, I'm sure it's the same in the States, there's absolutely fantastic archives, you know, which are spread out all over the place. And so I read a lot about it. And then for the one I've just done is more, it's not so contemporary. So it's based on um, Palestine in the 1930s, I just started to read around and I thought, oh, it looks interesting time. And the last 3 years, 36 to 39, was a period when Britain was struggling to keep control of an Arab insurgency in Palestine caused by rising Jewish immigration, which was in large part driven by the appalling anti-Semitism and attacks on Jewish people in Germany and elsewhere at the time. But the Britain had made these commitments under the famous Balfour Declaration of 1917 that they would facilitate Jewish immigration with a view in some time unspecified in the future of creating a Palestinian state. But it was a period of great tension because the Arab community, Palestinians, started to rebel in quite a very strong terms, and it got very violent, actually. It was dangerous. So Britain at one point had 10% of its military and police forces globally in Palestine trying to keep control of the situation. And eventually, cut a long story, I mean, the uprising petered out as the Second World War started. But of course, it came back after the war, and we know what happened thereafter. So what I'm not writing a political commentary, but I've used this backdrop to look at what happened to 3 policemen who volunteered for to be members of the Palestine police force. And I was very intrigued because as I read through the archives, and I went to a lot of places to dig around, and there are a lot of memoirs that people have left behind. Military people, policemen. There's books, there's even recordings. You can hear people talk about what it was like to be a policeman or a senior military officer in Palestine at the time. It was really fascinating stuff. I was intrigued by what made people volunteer to do this. What do they want to get out of it? And what happened to them? So I sort of used pretty much all the events that happened in the book. I drew from what I read, and I just created a story around it. And I'm just wondering how it'll turn out. So one of the areas, it's all very relevant to what's going on now. Nothing's really changed in the sense that behind all this is a struggle for land and rights. And for example, the Triangle of Death refers to 3 towns in Palestine and the West Bank: Jenin, Tulkarm, and Nazareth. And Jenin is a town today, which is under intense military activity by Israel. I think 40,000 people have been excluded. So this has always been an area of, opposition to the authorities, trying to impose solutions on them. And so that's it. So the Triangle of Death was one of the key areas of insurgency. So, it's what happened, how people were recruited, what happened to them. And I hope some people think it's okay. It was fun to do, so I'm thinking about what to do for another one now.
Okay, well, we look forward to the publication. I want to thank you
No, it's been a great pleasure.
for sharing, your considerable expertise and history on rights in Russia. This was an incredibly insightful and rich discussion. So thank you so much, Richard Wright.
Okay, thanks so much, and thank you to you and Simon. And I think all of us, I'm sure Simon's the same, and worked in this area. We very much regret the turn of events, and very much hope that one day we'll be able to sort of resume normal life. I mean, I have friends in Russia, and I find it immensely sad, actually, and disturbing about what's happening. And I'm a great lover of Russian culture, and this country has just produced so many rich things for the world. It all gets lost in the terrible events that are going on today. But thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it, and keep up the good work, you too.